Welcome in to another episode of the Motorcar Marketplace podcast. As always, I'm your host, Mac Moore. And on today's episode, we will be discussing a car, or at least I will be discussing a car. This isn't a guest hosted podcast that is very near and dear to my heart. And it's a car that I've spent considerable amount of time behind the wheel of, and that is the BMW 2002. And more specifically, I've spent time behind the wheel of a 1973 2002, not a TII, just a regular carbureted 2002. Excuse me, I'm a little sick, I guess. Anyhow, let's get right to it. The 2002 is a vehicle that has had a ton of upgrades over its lifetime, or at least tons of different variations, I should say. Not nearly as many as like something like the Lamborghini Gallardo, but still a considerable amount. The 2002 was produced by BMW from 1968 to 1976. Big low impact bumpers, those enormous things to provide additional safety, were added to the 2002 in 1974. And if you just look at a couple pictures, you can noticeably tell the difference between a 1973, 2002, and earlier, as opposed to a 1974 or later 2002. Those 1974 and later are just far less attractive, unfortunately, but it's like a lot of cars of that era. As soon as they got those enormous low impact bumpers, then they're aesthetically pleasing quality is just kind of diminished. The BMW 2002 also had a TII model produced, and the TII was designated for fuel-injected vehicles as opposed to carbureted vehicles. And so BMW produced those from 1972 to 1974, as well as a turbo model that was introduced in 1973 and then ceased production in 1974. So that was just a very short-run addition, but that was a very powerful car. And those today fetch an enormous figure, at least compared to the base 2002s and things of that nature. So they're very popular cars as far as modifying goes. Tons of people modify them, and they're also good for rallying. The 2002 was used in rallies as used for rallying when it first came out, and they're still used to that today. It is a very, very good first car to get into if you want to explore what classic car ownership is like. They're extremely reliable. Or at least as reliable as a 70s car can be, all year running cars. There's an abundance of extra parts if something breaks, and mechanics are very, very familiar with them. In addition to the BMW 2002 forums that have a plethora of knowledge. I mean, there's people from all over the world who are on these 2002 forums, and just tons of knowledge can be found on there. They're extremely easy to drive. And you probably won't lose much on depreciation if you were to purchase one, just because it's already an extremely old vehicle, or at least a classic car. And honestly, it might go up since the 2002 is a very desirable car and will always be a desirable car. So if you were looking for a vehicle to get into, then definitely look into the BMW 2002 as your introduction to classic car ownership. The base BMW 2002 had about 100 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a lot, really. It isn't a lot. These are not fast cars by any means, but they are fun cars. The TII had a little bit more horsepower at 125, which really is a noticeable difference. And then the turbo models had 170 horsepower, as well as a 5-speed manual gearbox, as opposed to the regular BMW 2002, which just had a 4-speed manual gearbox. And the 4 speeds is something that is just not the greatest quality in the world, I'll say. Or at least it's a very noticeable 4-speed. I mean, once you get up to highway speeds, it is not a pleasant car to be in. The market, though, for 2002s is a little bit all over the place just because of the different variations. The most desired 2002s, if you aren't looking at, say, something like a turbo, would be the 2002s with the round taillights, are also known as roundies, and those were produced from 1973 or earlier. So before the enormous bumpers, the 2002s had the round taillights, and if those vehicles are just highly desirable. And also the older the vehicle, or not the older, the newer the 2002, the more valuable it is, in the sense that the quality that BMW brought to the table is just a little bit higher. So if you have something like a 1968 2002 with round taillights as opposed to a 1973 2002, then you'll want to have the 1973 2002, just because the BMW switched the little things up. Maybe the gas seals are a little bit better, thankfully, and so that's what owners really want. A hugely desired modification on the 2002 is a 5-speed gearbox. Like I said before, the 2002 originally came with a 4-speed, so many owners put in a 5-speed manual gearbox. That does a world of difference to the car. So vehicles, and the pricing of them shows that as well, because vehicles that have the 5-speed gearbox are worth just a bit more than the vehicles with just a 4-speed, because the 5-speed is a modification that almost everyone is going to want in their 2002, unless you want it entirely original. And after driving a completely original one, I will say that you want a 5-speed gearbox as opposed to just a 4-speed. As far as pricing goes for the BMW 2002, like I said before, as far as the car itself, or at least the market, it is a bit all over the place, especially when it comes down to different variations. And if you get something like a base 2002 as opposed to a TII, or a 1972 as opposed to a 1974, but the 74 is a TII, so it's a little all over the place. And I'll just try and sum it up right here as best I can. For about $20,000, and even more, really, you should expect to get a really good, if not an excellent, roundy. So, or at least a good roundy up to an excellent, excellent big bumper one. After about $25,000, you should get a very, very nice 2002. Maybe even with different seats, certainly a 5-speed transmission, and maybe even a TII for that level of price category. For $25,000 or more. Fair to good ones can be found all day long at about $13,000, or even less. If you go on Craigslist, you can find some pretty good TII or pretty good 2002s that will need just a little bit of care, but they're probably in very good manual or mechanical condition, especially given their age, and that it's a car from the 60s or 70s, in the teens. So about from that $13,000 to $20,000 range, you could probably get a good driver example, a good honest BMW 2002. And this is really where you should look first if you want to get your first ever classic car, or just want to test the waters and not put too much money into it. Then you should probably look between $13,000 to $20,000 in that spot for a decent 2002. There'll more than likely be nothing wrong with it mechanically. There'll be good, honest cars, maybe a little paint scratch here or there, but for that price range, that's probably where you should start if you were looking into buying your first classic car and figuring out what the ownership experience is like. And if you hate it, well, you didn't spend that much money in the first place, and you more than likely get all of your money back. And even for that price range, you could probably get, you might be able to get a 5-speed. The 5-speeds certainly do command a premium, and these 2002s have gone up in value over the past couple years. So, for that price range between 13 and 20, you might be able to get a good 2002. With the 5-speed, but if not, you can certainly find just a good quality BMW 2002 to begin your classic car ownership experience. And another piece of buying advice, or at least my personal buying advice, is that since the BMW 2002 is so prevalent out there in the collector car world, you should probably pursue Craigslist or the 2002 BMW 2002 forums. just like BMW 2002 FAQ.com, before exploring dealership options. If you are comfortable, of course, buying from an individual seller, which majority of these owners are people who have taken care of their 2002 or they were inherited by someone who owned a BMW 2002. So if you are in the market to buy one, my first suggestion would be to look look for individual sellers on websites like Craigslist or forums, or even on Bring a Trailer, which is where tons of 2002s are sold, and those are some really interesting ones are found on Bring a Trailer. But my number one piece of buying advice, if you're looking into purchasing a 2002, would be to go to individual sellers first, as opposed to dealerships, just so you don't have to pay that dealership premium. So as far as pricing goes, that is the best pricing advice I can find, or at least I can give you, would be that if you're gonna purchase one, then try and buy one from an individual seller for a decent price point in the teens. Like I said before, I did get to spend a considerable amount of time with a 1973 BMW 2002, and so I'll share that story now. It was a BMW 2002, the 1973, that was painted or really resprayed in a Gulf yellow, and that color certainly caught everyone's attention. I believe the original color was actually red. You can see little flecks of red in the paint, but that was it was just resprayed in the Gulf yellow. It wasn't the greatest respray in the world, but nevertheless, it was resprayed. And I did get to drive this vehicle while I was in Atlanta because of the collector car brokerage I was working with at the time this past summer, before coming back to Dallas for school. I go to school at Stephen F. Austin, in case you're wondering. So anyway, I got to drive this BMW 2002 to the Athens, Georgia Cars and Coffee meet. So I drove from Atlanta to Athens, which is about an hour and a half, hour and 45-minute drive one way. Once I got there, though, I mean, everyone loves the 2002. And tons of people came up to me at the Cars and Coffee and just shared their own stories about them, or maybe their father owned one, or their uncle, or someone they knew owned one. And so they they would come up to me once I got there and then tell me the stories about it. They're extremely cool and very, very fun cars to drive. It's easy to lose the rear end on them because of the small tires, but that's really just fine. It's a very fun vehicle, like I said before. The worst part about driving it, honestly, though, was that a lot of the times people will just honk at you to get your attention so that they can tell you something about, how cool the car is, or which one of their family members own the car on the road, which is not the most fun thing to do in the world. But nevertheless, it does catch a lot of people's attention. And driving the 2002 through downtown Athens, Georgia, was certainly a very cool experience, and something where a lot of the like UGA sorority girls look at you and things like that. So it's a very cool, very fun experience. And I certainly would recommend just driving a BMW 2002 on a nice little day trip or road trip. It's a fun car to do. Just not when it's incredibly hot out, like in Atlanta summer, because it can get really toasty in there without any air conditioning pretty quickly. So that's probably the biggest drawback, if anything. So that'll do it for today's episode about the BMW 2002. I hope that you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening. Be sure to keep an eye out for the Motorcar Marketplace website, as it should be up here any day now, and hopefully up by the end of next week, or by the time the next Motorcar Marketplace podcast show goes up on the web. Like I said before, if you know anyone in the East Texas area looking to sell their collector car and could use my services, then please let us know, or let them know to reach out to me. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Motorcar Marketplace. And if you want to follow myself and see what I'm doing in my own personal life, then you can find me at LawMacMoore, LAWMACMOORE, across all social media platforms. Thank you again for listening. I hope that you've continued to enjoy this show, and that if you have any cars that you want me to talk about on future episodes, please let me know. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving as well. Now that that is come and gone, hope that you didn't kill your family or anything drastic like that, as always. I know that can be pretty tough sometimes. And stay tuned for next week's show. I'll try to do an interesting fun car to talk about for next week. But until then, I'll see you down the road. Thank you. Goodbye.